In this lesson, we'll begin the process of creating our own custom particle behaviors. Okay, so for this lesson and for the remaining lessons in this section, we're going to jump back to this aircraft project that you've been building for the previous sections of this course. So what I want to do is, if you take a look at the animation that we've built up to this point, we have the aircraft that's sort of docked underneath this fuel station, and then we have this hose that kind of separates this fuel hose and sort of whips around before the ship takes off. So what I want to do is use some particles to kind of give us the feel like we have some fuel that's maybe leaking or coming out of this hose. So it gives kind of a nice violet little blowing off effect where we have a little bit of fuel kind of spilling and splashing out and then sort of waving around as this hose flails around, sort of providing the pressure for this hose flailing. So let's start with the really simple setup. Let's start by going to panels. Let's go to our perspective view in this case. Okay. Now let's go ahead and go to particles, and let's just start by creating an emitter. All right. I'm going to go ahead and press the F key on my keyboard to frame in on this emitter. There we are. And it's going to drop this emitter right in my grid. You can see this is very far from all the other objects in my scene. There they are. But that's okay. But for now, we'll just really sort of concentrate on the movement of this and just start to talk about a few of the major attributes that you're going to have to be familiar with whenever working with these emitters. So at the moment, if I were to come in and play back my timeline, you can see we have these little particles that are starting to spill out. There we are, and these might be a little bit easier if I turn off my grid. So you can see we have these little dots that are spilling out from this emitter. Now, let's talk about some of the attributes that are related to this. So I'm going to press Control A on my keyboard, and you can see we actually have several different tabs. We have the particle, we have the particle shape, and we have the emitter. So let's first start by talking about some of these different attributes found in the emitter itself. Now the emitter, just like the name suggests, controls the overall appearance or the behavior of the particles that are emitted from this little point. So at the moment, we have, starting at the top, the emitter type. Right now this is set to an omni, short for omnidirectional, which means that these particles are going to be shot out in all directions in sort of a 360-degree spherical pattern. We also have the ability to change this, so we could change this to maybe something like a directional, which you'll notice once we change this, the particles really don't change. Again, if you remember from our previous lesson, the particles won't change until we rewind our timeline and then start to play back again. So with a directional emitter, we can start to really define just a direction. In this case, you can see it's just sort of spitting out one long little string of particles. Now, if I scroll down and start to look at this direction, this is where we can start to change exactly which direction these little guys are going to be emitted from. Right now they're being emitted along this direction X. So direction X is set to 1, which means it has full effect. You can see it's emitting it along this world X axis. If I set this to 0, we basically have no movement along the X, Y, or Z axis, which gives us no particles at that point. Let's say I wanted my particles to maybe go straight up. I could set the direction Y to 1. You can see now they spew straight up. Let's say if I wanted them to go down, I could set that to -1. And now that emitter will emit those particles in that particular direction. Another option that we have is that we could actually just take our emitter and rotate that along a direction that we want. And now, once we start to rotate that, what we should see is these particles changing, which in my case, you can see that's not quite happening. And the reason for that is because at the moment, I actually don't have the particle emitter itself selected when I'm trying to rotate. What I'm actually rotating right now are the particles themselves, which is not correct. So what we should see, if I go back to the emitter itself and try to rotate this, again, the particles themselves don't seem like they're updating. But always remember, you have to rewind your timeline and now play back again. And now you can see that these particles are obeying this new emitter orientation. Okay, again, rewind and play, and there we go. So a couple of different ways of controlling the direction that your particles are flowing. Below this, we have our spread. Now the spread will prevent us from getting sort of this little straight line. As we start to dial up our spread, we should start to see a little bit more of a spray of particles. As this spread starts to get higher and higher, you can start to see that we get more and more of this omnidirectional appearance. So for different purposes, you can, again, start to really control this and start to really fine-tune just how far these particles are spreading out from their point of origin, which is really, really nice. So what we can start to do is, let's start to pull our camera back, and let's see if we can find where these particles need to be. So I'm going to grab my emitter, making sure I do grab the emitter and not the particles themselves. And let's start to position these sort of up close to the hose. So I'm going to jump to my different views and start by maybe aligning this in the side view. I'll try to get that lined up with sort of the end of the hose over here. And notice that still doesn't get us there in the other views, so jump to maybe my front view now. Again, just grab that emitter, position that pretty close to the opening of this hose. There we go. Now back in our perspective view, that starts to line up a lot better. Okay, now just to make this a little bit easier to work with, what I might try to do is just turn off the visibility for that ship. There we go. And now we can sort of see the effect of these particles along with the hose. Now, in my case, we have sort of a situation where this scene is actually pretty large, which means that the movement of these particles is what appears to be really, really slow, although that's not really the case. It's just that these particles are taking a really long time to travel based on the overall size of our scene. So this is where we can start to control things like the speed. So as we start to dial this up, we can start to get our particles moving at a little bit faster rate. Now for my particles, because I want them to really sort of have a lot of force to them as this hose kind of blows off the side of that ship, I'm going to really try to crank this speed up a little bit. So let's try maybe something like a speed of 20. And again, you'll notice that my existing particles don't obey that new setting. It's only the new particles that get created. That's a little bit better. Let's maybe bump this up a little bit higher, something like 50. All right, that's a little bit better, but again, maybe not quite forceful enough, so we can just continue to bump this up until we find a value that works. Okay, so maybe something like 80 in my case will work okay. Now below this we have our speed random. Now at the moment, all of these particles are moving at the exact same speed. In reality, that's probably never going to happen. But what we can do is start to introduce a little bit of randomization to our speed. So that way, while our base speed is set to 80, we can have particles that move either 10 units slower or 10 units faster. And the higher we set this randomization up, the more variance we get in the overall speed of our particles. Okay, so you can see now we have really much more dramatic changes. Some are moving really, really slow, some are moving really, really fast. Now, let's come in. You can see at the moment the orientation of my emitter doesn't match anywhere close to the orientation of my hose. So let's just try to rewind this back. There we go, and this might take a few tries because again, sometimes getting your particles to stay oriented correctly can be a little bit of a tricky proposition, especially when you need them to emit in a very particular direction. Okay, so that should work for us. So now we have some particles that are sort of emitting out, and it looks like they have a nice bit of speed and a bit of force. As far as their overall spread, this is probably pretty acceptable. Now, what I need to do is to get these particles moving along with the hose. So we're going to take a look at that process in our next lesson.